In the shadows of history, certain names survive, not because they were noble or virtuous, but because they stood at the center of something so dark, so unspoken, that centuries later, we still struggle to look at it directly. One of those names is Arsinoe II, a woman born into power but imprisoned by it, a queen whose story is equal parts triumph and horror. She was not remembered as just a royal consort or as a sister to kings, but as the woman who transformed her own suffering into a political weapon and left behind a dynasty defined by secrecy, silence, and corruption. This is not the story you will find in school textbooks or glossy museum plaques. This is the tale buried beneath ceremonial inscriptions and polished marble, whispered about but rarely said aloud. A tale where royal power was not just gilded crowns and marble palaces, but hidden rooms, closed doors, and choices so terrible that they ripple across centuries. It begins not with a queen, but with a child. Arsinoe was born in 316 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. Her father, Ptolemy I, had once stood at Alexander's side as a general. When the great conqueror died, his empire shattered into fragments claimed by ambitious men, and Egypt, rich, ancient, overflowing with knowledge and wealth, fell into Ptolemy's hands. To the outside world, he was a ruler blessed by the gods, heir to a tradition stretching back to the pharaohs. To those within the palace, however, Ptolemy was a man obsessed with keeping his family's rule unshakable. For him, bloodlines were not sacred, they were strategic. From childhood, Arsinoe was raised with this knowledge. Tutors drilled into her the belief that Ptolemaic rulers were not like other mortals. They were descendants of gods, children of divinity, destined to stand apart from ordinary humanity. Marriages, her teachers whispered, were not about love or even alliance. They were about purity, the preservation of royal blood at any cost. She learned Greek, Egyptian, and Aramaic. She memorized dynastic genealogies. She was prepared in every way not to live a normal life, but to play a role in a theater of politics that was older than she was. But behind these lessons lurked a darker truth. Purity was a mask. Behind it stood fear. Fear of rivals, fear of outsiders, fear of dilution, fear that the dynasty's claim might weaken if their blood was not kept unnaturally contained. And into this doctrine of silence and secrecy, Arsinoe's girlhood slowly dissolved. As she grew, she sensed a shift. The palace, once a playground of gardens and courtyards, began to feel like a maze. The gaze of her father, once protective, grew colder, sharper, and heavier, with expectations no child should ever bear. Her mother receded into silence. Her tutors taught obedience in every gesture, and servants avoided her eyes. The unspoken rule was clear. What happened in the palace stayed buried in its marble walls. By the time Arsinoe was a teenager, her innocence had been replaced with watchfulness. She learned to smile on command, to hide her thoughts, to move gracefully while her mind built invisible walls around itself. She learned how silence could be armor, how stillness could be survival. And so, when her father announced that she was to be married at just 16 years old, she did not protest. She did not cry. She did not break. She simply stood in ceremonial dress, her face a mask carved of marble, and accepted her exile. Her new husband was Lysimachus, an aging king of Thrace. To most, the marriage looked like a political victory. Egypt secured a powerful ally, and Arsinoe became queen of a foreign court. But to her, it was something else entirely. It was escape. For the first time, she left behind the palace where shadows lingered at every doorway. For the first time, she crossed the Mediterranean not as a child trembling in silken halls, but as a woman determined to survive. When she arrived in Thrace, Arsinoe expected more of the same, another cage, another ruler waiting to dictate her life. But what she found was something different. Perhaps not love, but a strange kind of protection. Lysimachus, scarred and weary from decades of war, treated her not as prey, but as a partner. Their marriage bed was not what she feared. Instead, he gave her space, words, and even trust. In his twilight years, he saw her not just as a young queen, but as an advisor. And so Arsinoe began to learn. For 5 years, she sat in council chambers, watched generals argue, studied maps of Thrace's borders, and listened to whispers of rebellion. Slowly, she carved out power, not just as a queen, but as a strategist. When Lysimachus faltered with age, she took up the reins of governance. She arranged trade treaties, soothed unrest, and stabilized a fragile kingdom. Every smile she gave was deliberate, every word she spoke calculated, every alliance carefully woven. And yet, the past never fully released her. In the throne rooms of Thrace, she encountered a new threat, Agathocles, Lysimachus's ambitious son. He saw her not as a queen, but as a danger to his inheritance. His eyes burned not with desire, but with calculation. He knew that a young Egyptian queen meant heirs, rivals who might one day threaten his claim. To him, Arsinoe was not just an inconvenience, she was a threat to eliminate. And so Arsinoe learned her second great lesson of survival. In every court, trust is a currency rarer than gold. Her years in Thrace hardened her into steel, but steel can break under enough pressure. And when Lysimachus was killed in battle in 281 BCE, that pressure came crashing down. Agathocles, now unchallenged, wasted no time. Arsinoe was banished from Thrace, stripped of her power, forced once again to flee with nothing but jewels hidden in her garments and her relentless will to endure. At 35, she was a queen without a kingdom. But Arsinoe was no longer the frightened girl of Alexandria. She was no longer the wary bride of Thrace. She had transformed into something far more dangerous, a woman who understood that survival required not just endurance, but the ruthless willingness to seize opportunity when it appeared. And that opportunity came when she returned to Egypt. The land she had once fled now called her back. Her father was gone. The throne sat under her brother, Ptolemy II, a man burdened with unrest, conspiracies, and the crumbling weight of a kingdom that threatened to slip away from him. When Arsinoe stepped back into Alexandria's gleaming palaces, she brought with her scars, secrets, and experience her brother desperately needed. At first, she stood in the background. She whispered counsel, offered insights in private, became a quiet presence at his side. But slowly, her influence grew. She was not just his sister. She became his advisor, his strategist, his indispensable partner in the game of survival. And yet, in the flicker of torchlight, beneath the marble arches, where history and myth blurred, something else stirred, something darker. It was not enough for Ptolemy to have her counsel. He wanted to bind her to him in a way that would silence opposition, a way that would make his reign appear divinely ordained. And so, one winter night, he called her to his chambers with a proposal that would seal both their fates. It was a proposal so unthinkable that even in an age of ruthless politics and godlike kings, it carried the weight of dread. A proposal that would take the dynasty's obsession with purity to its most extreme form. Ptolemy asked his sister to become his queen, and in that moment, Arsinoe stood once more at the threshold of a choice she could never escape. Would she refuse and risk everything she had clawed back, or would she step willingly into the same darkness that had once consumed her? The answer she gave would reshape Egypt for centuries, and it would mark her not as victim nor survivor, but as architect of a dynasty's darkest legacy. The night her brother made his proposal, Arsinoe II felt the walls of the palace close in around her. Alexandria's halls, with their polished marble and golden lamps, suddenly seemed less like corridors of power and more like the bars of a cage. Ptolemy II did not speak with hesitation. He spoke with the certainty of a man who believed the gods themselves demanded it. A union between brother and sister, he said, would not only purify the dynasty, it would sanctify it. For Arsinoe, the silence that followed was not indecision, it was calculation. She had spent her life being used as a pawn, her body claimed by family duty, her freedom sacrificed to dynastic politics. Now, she stood before a choice that was no choice at all. To refuse meant exile or death. To accept meant becoming the symbol of a dynasty's most unholy doctrine. And so, she accepted. The marriage of Arsinoe II and Ptolemy II was staged with more splendor than any Egypt had seen in generations. Priests declared it a sacred union. Greek nobles praised it as proof of royal purity. Crowds watched with awe as the brother and sister ascended the altar, their union proclaimed divine. But beneath the hymns and the incense, Arsinoe's heart was not walking toward marriage. It was walking toward power. For her, the ceremony was no wedding. It was a coronation. From that moment on, Arsinoe was not just the wife of Egypt's ruler. She was his equal. Her face appeared on coins beside his, an unprecedented honor for a queen. Foreign envoys quickly learned that decisions were not made without her presence. She reorganized Egypt's finances, strengthened its borders, expanded its trade routes, and secured alliances that ensured the kingdom's survival. Ptolemy wore the crown, but Arsinoe guided the throne. And yet, her rise to power came at a terrible cost. The system that had once destroyed her youth was now the system she defended. What had once been whispered in shadows became policy carved into stone. Arsinoe did not merely accept the idea of sibling unions. She championed it. She drafted protocols to ensure it continued for generations. She forged theological justifications that turned what had once been hidden into something sanctified. In doing so, she transformed her personal suffering into a political doctrine. It is one of the darkest paradoxes in history. A woman who endured silence and fear, who once walked the halls of Alexandria as a trembling child, became the architect of the very institution that had crushed her. The system that had victimized her became her greatest weapon, and in wielding it, she ensured that the dynasty's curse would outlive her by centuries. But power, no matter how absolute, is fragile. Behind the walls of Alexandria, whispers lingered. Some saw her as a goddess, the divine Philadelphus, the beloved of her brother. Others saw her as something more unsettling, a queen who had traded her humanity for a throne. Still others wondered if the gods themselves might one day demand a reckoning. By the 270s BCE, Arsinoe's body began to fail her. She was only in her mid-40s, but years of strain and illness wore her down. Her brother-husband grieved her decline, and when she died, he did what kings often do when they cannot face mortality. He declared her a goddess. Her temples rose, her image was worshipped, her name immortalized. To the people, she was the divine Philadelphia, eternal queen of Egypt. But history remembers differently. The dynasty she helped mold became infamous for the very tradition she cemented. For 200 years, siblings would marry siblings, a cycle of silence and corruption that culminated in the tragic figure of Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Egypt, whose life ended in betrayal and ruin. The shadow of Arsinoe's choices stretched far beyond her lifetime, shaping not just a dynasty, but the way history itself would judge her. And perhaps this is the most haunting truth of all. Arsinoe II was not just a victim. She was not just a survivor. She was both. And she was also something else entirely. The proof that power can twist even the deepest wounds into weapons. That those who are broken by a system can, in turn, become the ones who uphold it. It is tempting to judge her harshly, to see her as a woman who embraced the very chains that once bound her. But in the dim light of history, her story is more complicated than judgment. She lived in a world where choice was an illusion, where silence was survival, and where the only way to endure was to become the very force that once oppressed her. Before we go further, I want to pause. If you've been drawn into this story, if you feel the weight of this queen's fate pressing through the centuries, I'd ask you to subscribe, not for me, but so that you can continue to hear these stories. Stories that textbooks often bury, but which reveal the hidden darknesses of history. Every subscribe helps keep these shadows alive so that they are not forgotten, because forgetting is dangerous. Arsinoe's tale reminds us that cycles of silence and power do not stay in the past. They reappear in different forms, in families, in institutions, in systems that mask exploitation as tradition. What happened in Alexandria's Golden Halls is not so different from what can happen anywhere when power is left unchecked and silence becomes the rule. As Arsinoe lay dying in 270 BCE, perhaps she understood this irony. Perhaps she saw that the very institution she had preserved was not eternal, that the gods she invoked were not protectors but excuses, and that her life, one of suffering, triumph, and contradiction, would become both a cautionary tale and a curse handed down to those who came after. Her brother's grief was real, but so too was his fear. By declaring her divine, he attempted to erase the human scars of her life. A goddess does not suffer. A goddess does not cry. A goddess does not remember. And so Arsinoe II was transformed in death into something she had never been in life, untouchable. But gods are made of memory, and memory has a way of twisting. Today, when we look back at the Ptolemaic dynasty, we see splendor and tragedy, libraries and lighthouses, marble and myth. But threaded through all of it is Arsinoe's legacy, a reminder that behind every golden mask, there may be shadows too heavy to name, and that is why her story matters. Not because she was flawless, but because she was human, because she embodies the unsettling truth that even those who suffer the most can become the guardians of suffering, and that power, once grasped, rarely lets go without leaving a mark. When you next hear of Cleopatra, or of the Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt as gods on earth, Remember Arsinoe II. Remember that behind the glory of empire lay silence, secrecy, and a queen who turned her own scars into state policy. Her name may be celebrated in temples, but her true legacy is whispered in the dust of Alexandria. Power does not heal wounds, it only reshapes them. And the question that lingers is this: was Arsinoe a victim forever trapped in a cycle she could not escape? Or was she a strategist who knowingly passed her curse to the future? I'd like to hear what you think. Was she a tragic figure, or was she something more unsettling? A queen who became the very force she once feared? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's see what shadows of history you uncover.